In the summer of 1876, a column of cavalry rode into a valley they thought they understood, and vanished from history in less than an hour. What happened on that ridge has been debated for nearly 150 years, told in fragments, argued over in whispers, and marked only by the wind across the grass. This is the story of the day the sun stood still over the Little Bighorn, and the men who never rode out. The morning was warm, yet a strange stillness hung over the prairie. The air tasted of dust and distant water, and the horses, even after hours of marching, tossed their heads as if they sensed something beyond human sight. Captain's voice cut across the rhythmic clop of hooves. "Nice day to the front. How far back is the packs right now?" The reply came without hesitation, though it carried a trace of unease. 2-3 miles, give or take. Custer, sitting high in the saddle, adjusted his gaze to the open sweep ahead. "You will take your battalion and diverge at a left oblique of about 45 degrees. Sweep everything you see before you. Pitch into anything you might come across." The captain hesitated, his hand tightening slightly on the reins. "How do we? We've got to keep the regiment together, General. If this camp is as big as they say, we're going to need every man we've got." Custer's eyes didn't waver. "You have your orders." The words landed like iron. Still, the captain pressed. "General, I'm not clear about this. How much of an area do you want me to scout?" "You heard me, Captain. Sweep the area." There was nothing left to say. The battalion peeled away, the sound of hoofbeats growing fainter until they merged with the wind. For a moment, the prairie seemed empty again, but reports began trickling back almost immediately, small flashes of detail, each one like a single thread in a larger tapestry no one could yet see. One scout spoke of a burial lodge, ornate and untouched, a thing so sacred he and his men refused to pass it. Another messenger rode hard to deliver supplementary orders. If they found nothing, they were to advance to the second line of bluffs, keeping at least one mounted officer with 5 or 6 men well ahead, watching for any sign of movement. It wasn't long before those signs came. "Scouts have come across a fancy burial lodge," another rider reported breathlessly. "They say they won't go past it." The tension in the air thickened. A burial lodge was more than just a marker, it was a warning, a boundary line drawn in the oldest language on the plains. The sun crept higher, and in the growing heat, the pace slowed. Somewhere behind them, the pack train lagged even farther. Dust clung to sweat-slick uniforms and the raw leather of saddles. In the distance, the horizon rippled like molten glass, but beneath that shimmering veil, shadows moved. Orders rippled forward. "Tell the captain, if we find nothing, he is to go to the second line of bluffs." The rhythm of the day was broken when a column of scouts crested a low ridge and froze. Below them, half hidden in a curve of the valley, lay the first unmistakable signs of life, smoke, faint but deliberate, rising in slow ribbons against the pale sky. The word passed quickly. "General, there's movement ahead." Custer studied the horizon for a long moment. Then, "Advance." The horses moved as one, their hooves drumming the earth. Yet with each mile, the valley revealed more, shapes of lodges appearing like ghosts through the heat haze, the low glint of river water, the faint hum of activity carried on the wind. It was no scattered encampment. This was something else entirely. A decision loomed. The scouts knew it. The captains felt it. Even the youngest troopers, still flushed with the bravado of the march, sensed it. Somewhere in the midst of this quiet approach, Custer signaled to his officers. The regiment would split. Major Reno was to cross the river and strike the upper end of the camp. Captain Benteen would reconnoiter to the southeast. The rest, Custer's own command, would follow the ridgeline and cut off any escape downriver. No one voiced it aloud, but the split left some uneasy. The valley was broad, and the encampment, if the glimpses so far were to be believed, was larger than anyone had dared expect. The sun pressed down harder, and the air shimmered with heat. Sweat darkened the flanks of the horses. Far off, The blue ribbon of the river bent in a lazy arc, but the land around it was alive now, figures moving in and out of the lodges, horses being driven toward higher ground, a sudden burst of activity that hadn't been there before. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint beat of drums. It was impossible to tell if the sound was real or only the echo of the troopers' own pulse in their ears. A question hovered, unspoken but inescapable: had they been seen? And if so, what would the answer be? For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold. The river lay ahead like a glimmering line of glass, but its beauty was deceptive. The current was quick, the banks steep in places, and the far side was no empty stretch of grassland. It was alive, breathing, waiting. Major Reno, already pushing his men forward, cast a glance over his shoulder at the thin plume of dust marking where Benteen had turned southeast. Beyond that, somewhere unseen, Custer's column moved along the ridgeline. Each path was a gamble, and Reno could only trust his would be enough to hold the weight of the plan. Orders came crisp and clear. Move forward at your best speed, Major. You'll be supported by the whole command. The promise rang in Reno's ears as he spurred his horse, but already he could feel the vastness of the valley swallowing sound and distance. Support, in such a place, could be a long time coming. The first sight of the village up close was nothing short of staggering. Lodges stretched farther than he could count, their hides painted in patterns that told stories older than the maps in any officer's case. Smoke curled from cooking fires. Dogs barked. And everywhere, the flash of movement, men, women, children, turning, pointing, shouting. No one in Reno's command had expected this. This was no scattered band, it was a gathering. Perhaps the largest they had ever seen. Still, the bugle's call cut through the air: charge. The line surged forward, hooves breaking into the shallows. Water churned white around them as the horses scrambled up the far bank, muscles straining under the sudden climb. Then they were on the flat, galloping hard toward the village. From the first rifle cracks, Reno knew the element of surprise was gone. Warriors rode out to meet them, swift as shadows, their ponies weaving through the grass. The air filled with the hiss of arrows, the sharp whine of bullets. Somewhere ahead, riders peeled away to the left, circling wide, dust billowing in their wake. Reno caught sight of them for a heartbeat before they vanished behind the lodges. Were they fleeing, or flanking? Within minutes, the charge began to falter. Reno's line compressed, the forward push slowing under the weight of return fire. The smell of gunpowder and churned earth filled the air. Horses screamed as they stumbled or went down. Reno called for a halt and ordered his men into a skirmish line. They dismounted in the grass, using the horses as living barricades, rifles working furiously as the warriors closed in from every angle. It became clear, painfully clear, that the village was not breaking. If anything, its defenders were multiplying by the minute. From beyond the lodges, more riders appeared, the dust of their approach catching the sun like a storm cloud. Reno's decision was made in an instant. Fall back to the timber. The retreat to the riverbank was chaos, half running, half firing, men glancing over their shoulders at the oncoming wave. They reached a stand of cottonwoods, the thick trunks offering some shelter, and there they reformed, firing from behind the trees, the sound of their rifles sharp against the deeper roar of the valley. But the timber could not hold forever. The warriors pressed in from the flanks, their shouts rising above the gunfire. One by one, Reno's men began looking toward the river, the only way back to higher ground. And then came the order that would be remembered: mount up. For the bluffs. What followed was a desperate, pounding flight across the shallows, men and horses alike splashing through the current while gunfire snapped over the water. Some made the far bank. Others did not. From the ridge above, the survivors looked back toward the valley, the village now a blur through dust and smoke. There was no sign of Custer's column. No word from Benteen. Only the knowledge that somewhere, out there in that vast sweep of lodges and warriors, the rest of the regiment was fighting a battle whose outcome they could not yet see. The question burned in every mind, had the plan already unraveled beyond saving? For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold. From the high spine of the bluffs, Custer's path gave him a view of the valley unlike any Reno had seen. Below, the river wound in silver arcs, and beyond it lay the sprawling heart of the encampment. It was vast, so vast that from this height, the lodges seemed to ripple endlessly along the river's bend, their smoke signals weaving into a single gray veil over the grassland. Custer's scouts rode hard along the ridge, peering down through the haze, counting what they could. Even they, men hardened to the plains and to the ways of its people, could not mask their unease. "It's bigger than we thought," one murmured. "Bigger than all the maps put together." Custer said nothing at first, his gaze fixed far ahead. In his mind, speed was the answer. Strike the northern end, cut off escape, keep them running. It had worked before. Why not here? Still, there were signs he could not ignore. Riders moved on the far side of the river, trailing dust, vanishing behind ridges only to appear again closer. It was the kind of movement that meant more than chance, a pattern forming in the space between what was seen and unseen. An orderly approached at a gallop, his horse lathered. "Sir, Benteen's not yet in position. Reno's engaged the village." Custer's head turned sharply. "Engaged?" "Yes, sir." But, the messenger hesitated, catching his breath. "It's heavy fire." If the news troubled Custer, it didn't show. He waved the man back and ordered his column forward, hugging the bluffs until they could swing down toward the river. The sound of gunfire now reached them clearly, rolling up from the south in quick, uneven bursts. The men in the ranks traded glances. No one could see Reno's fight directly, but the rhythm of the shots told a story, one of retreat, of men firing over their shoulders, of a line being pressed too hard. Yet Custer pressed on. They passed through a shallow draw, the ground narrowing so that the column stretched into a long, thin line. Scouts on the flanks began signaling, small, sharp motions with their hands, pointing ahead, pointing downriver. What they saw was movement, riders coming fast from the far side, cutting across the river upstream, their ponies moving like water over stone. The dust they raised caught the sunlight and spread wide, like wings closing in. Custer called for a halt, surveying the northern end of the village from a low rise. Here, the lodges clustered thick along a bend, their painted hides swaying in the breeze. Children darted between them. Horses were being driven toward the open plain, their herders glancing back toward the ridgeline where the soldiers waited. One of the scouts, a seasoned man named Curly, shifted in his saddle. "They're not running, sir." Custer's gaze narrowed. "They will." But the riders upstream had drawn closer, their numbers swelling. Behind them, the dust on the horizon thickened, another force moving in, unseen but unmistakable. The officers rode up alongside Custer. Voices dropped to urgent murmurs. "If Reno's been pushed back," one began. "We cut through here," Custer interrupted, pointing toward the bend. "Fast. We'll hit them before they know it." It was a gamble, one that left no room for delay, no margin for retreat. The column moved down from the bluff, the ground soft beneath the horses' hooves, the air thick with the smell of trampled grass and river water. They were close now, close enough to hear the shouts from the village, the pounding of hooves on the far bank, the low hum of drums threading through it all. Somewhere beyond the bend, unseen by Custer's men, more warriors were crossing the river, fanning out through the grass in a wide arc that would soon fold back toward the soldiers' flanks. No one in the column could yet see the circle tightening. But the sound in the air was changing, the cadence of the drums shifting, the calls growing sharper, closer, echoing off the bluffs like voices from all directions at once. And in that moment, high on the rise they just left, a solitary scout reined in his horse and watched the dust trails from both ends of the valley begin to meet. Under his breath, he asked the question no order could answer: was the trap already closed? For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold. The northern edge of the encampment was alive with sound before Custer's column had even broken from the cover of the bluff. What had been the quiet thrum of daily life, the shuffle of children, the clink of tools, the creak of lodge poles, became a rapid, pulsing chaos. Dogs barked furiously. Horses neighed and stamped, sensing the shift. From within the largest lodges, elders emerged into the sunlight, their eyes scanning the horizon. The first riders had already thundered through the narrow lanes between shelters, calling out warnings in voices that carried urgency without panic. This was not the startled cry of a people caught unaware, it was the practiced signal of a village ready to move, ready to defend. On the bluffs, Custer gave the signal. The column broke forward in two lines, their shadows flashing across the grass as the sun caught their carbines and sabers. The order was simple: push hard, break through, drive them toward the center. But the ground itself seemed to resist them. A tangle of shallow ravines and dips broke the charge into uneven bursts. Some troops surged ahead, others slowed to pick their way across the broken terrain. And in each lull, the defenders' numbers grew. Warriors poured out from the far side of the village, their ponies darting in wide arcs, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the hot air like smoke. They didn't rush straight into the soldiers' line, they swept along the edges, closing the distance in curved, weaving paths, each one a moving target that was gone the instant a rifle found its aim. From his vantage, Custer could see the far end of the encampment still bristling with activity. Herds of horses were being driven farther upriver, out of sight. Women were taking down lodge coverings in quick, practiced motions, poles collapsing in seconds. Yet even as the village shifted, the warriors remained, their numbers swelling until the open ground before Custer looked like a living tide. The first shots cracked out from the soldiers' line. The reply came instantly, a volley from three sides, the sound sharp and flat in the dry air. Horses stumbled, men pitched forward in their saddles, and still the charge pressed on. One of the lieutenants, Keogh, swung his company toward a low rise on the right, hoping to flank the defenders and cut them off from the river. For a moment, it seemed to work, the warriors before him wheeled back, scattering toward the lodges. But as Keogh pushed forward, a fresh wave appeared from the far bank, crossing at a narrow ford unseen until the last second. Custer's center pushed into the open ground, the lodges now less than 100 yards away. The smells of wood smoke and sun-warmed hides filled the air, mingling with the acrid sting of powder. For an instant, the village lay open before them, a maze of shadows and color, the flash of movement in every gap. And then the sound came. Not the scattered crack of rifles, but the deeper, rolling roar of hundreds of voices, layered with the drumbeat that had been growing since they'd first descended from the ridge. It wasn't just noise, it was rhythm, pulsing in time with the gallop of ponies and the footfalls of men closing in. From the left, a line of warriors broke into a full charge, their ponies stretched low over the grass, rifles and bows raised. The soldiers turned to meet them, their volley dropping the first few riders, but the line behind them did not slow. They poured through the gap between two companies, wheeling in close, firing at such short range that the smoke rolled back over both sides at once. In the center, Custer's men fought to hold their ground, forming quick defensive knots as the tide shifted. There was no clear front now, the fight had become a series of whirling circles, each group of soldiers surrounded, defending on all sides. From the far ridge, unseen by Custer, more riders were streaming down toward the fight. The dust of their approach blended into the haze over the valley, but their presence was felt in the tightening ring around the soldiers. For those inside the village, the defenders' confidence grew with each passing minute. This was no sudden rout, no desperate break for safety. They knew the land, knew the rhythms of the fight, and now, they could see what the soldiers could not, every path to escape was narrowing. Somewhere behind the rising wall of dust and gunfire, the river gleamed briefly in the sun. It might have been a path back, had it not already been crossed by more warriors, their ponies' hooves striking sparks from the stones as they came on. From the center of the fight, amid the roar and smoke, Custer looked toward the far end of the village, where the lodges still stood. He could not see the end of them, only the endless line of shapes stretching into the haze. And for the first time, the thought may have come unbidden, was the village simply too large to break? For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold. The battlefield no longer had a center. It had splintered into fragments, each one a desperate knot of men holding whatever ground they could find. What had begun as a coordinated advance now moved in fits and starts, the soldiers reacting to threats they could barely see through the haze. Captain Keogh's company had swung wide to the right, pushing toward a low hillock that promised a vantage over the village. But the hill was already in motion, not earth, but dust kicked up by riders circling its base. The moment Keogh's men reached its slope, the riders surged upward, cutting between the horses and forcing the soldiers to fight on foot. The air rang with sharp, flat rifle cracks, the deeper boom of carbines, and the almost constant whine of rounds cutting through the heat. A man beside Keogh staggered back, his hat spinning away in the dust, his carbine slipping from his grip. Keogh dragged him toward a shallow depression in the ground, shouting for the rest to hold their line. Across the broken terrain, Custer's main group still pushed forward, but their advance slowed to a crawl. Every few yards brought another rush of defenders from an unexpected angle. Sometimes they came low and fast, ponies skimming the grass. Other times they rose from behind the folds in the earth, firing at close range before melting back into the ground. Lieutenant Calhoun's wing had fared no better. They had found themselves on an exposed slope, the grass flattened by wind and hooves, with nowhere to anchor their defense. From both sides, warriors closed in, their approach masked by the constant noise. Calhoun ordered his men into a skirmish line, but the ground gave no cover, and the line folded back toward the crest. Above it all, the heat pressed down, heavy and unyielding. Powder smoke clung to the air, making each breath taste of sulfur and dust. The sun caught on the haze, turning the valley into a shimmering blur where distance meant nothing. A rider could be 100 yards away or 10, and you wouldn't know until he was on you. Somewhere to the south, the sound of gunfire rose sharply, then faltered. It was impossible to know whether Reno still fought, whether Benteen was near, or whether those sounds were something else entirely. Custer's plan had depended on coordination. Now, there was only silence between the scattered bursts of newsless noise. A bugle call rose from near Custer's position, short, clipped, almost swallowed by the roar. It was answered not with a rally, but with a renewed push from the defenders, as though they knew the meaning of the call as well as the soldiers did. Keogh's position on the right began to buckle. One by one, his men fell back toward a low swale, firing as they moved, the dust mixing with the blood on their sleeves and tunics. The riders on their flank pressed harder, cutting off any path back toward Custer's main group. The space between the two wings grew wider, the gap filling with dust, movement, and the dark shapes of mounted men who did not yield. Custer, still in the center, urged his men toward a low ridge ahead. From there, they might see a path, perhaps even a way to link back with Keogh. But as they crested it, the sight that met them was not an opening, but another wave of warriors, their ponies' manes flying, their weapons already raised. The ridge offered no refuge. They could not hold it long. And behind them, the way they had come was no safer, more movement there, more dust, more flashes of color and steel in the sun. Somewhere in the chaos, Curly the scout reined in, scanning the valley with the eyes of a man who understood what the soldiers did not yet see. The dust trails on every horizon were no longer converging. They had converged. He turned his pony toward a narrow draw leading away from the fight, the question pounding in his mind as hard as his heartbeat: was anyone going to make it out of this alive? For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold. The ridge that Custer's men had gained was no fortress. It was a strip of exposed earth, its edges sloping down into draws and gullies that offered cover to anyone approaching, anyone except the men who now occupied it. From three sides, movement pressed closer, the circle tightening with each passing minute. Custer rode the length of the position, his voice steady despite the roar around them. He urged his men to keep their fire deliberate, to hold until they saw the whites of eyes or the glint of steel. Every shot counted now, there would be no resupply. To the east, Calhoun's company had been driven back in fragments. Some of his men reached the ridge, faces gray with dust and exhaustion. Others had fallen in the grass below, their weapons still clutched in stiffening hands. The space between the companies was gone, the fight had become one line, a single knot of resistance on the bare spine of the hill. On the far right, Keogh's company had disappeared from view. No messenger came. No sound rose from that quarter now, only the drifting haze of powder smoke and the erratic flash of movement that never drew closer. Whether they still fought or had already fallen, no one could tell. The defenders moved with a confidence that could be felt as much as seen. They no longer probed cautiously, they surged forward in bursts, closing the distance, slipping behind the low swells of ground to fire at near point blank. The air above the ridge hissed with lead, each near miss tearing through grass or whistling past an ear. Custer dismounted part of his command, forming a skirmish line that curved along the ridge's crest. Horses were led to the center, huddled and stamping, their eyes rolling white in fear. Some men crouched behind the animals for what little shelter they offered, others lay flat, rifles balanced along the ridge edge. A bugle call cut through the noise, a short, sharp note. It might have been a rally, it might have been an order to hold. No one moved from their place. Every man knew now that there was no withdrawal. There was only here. From the defender's perspective, the ridge looked like a rock in a rising tide. Every rush forced the soldiers back into a tighter cluster, every volley from below took one more from the line. They spoke to one another between shots, marking targets, encouraging the younger ones, reminding each other to stay low. A rush from the north broke into the line's flank, ponies leaping the low edge of the slope, riders firing down into the press. The soldiers wheeled to meet them, the formation fracturing in the turn. Another rush came from the south, and then the west, until every direction was a direction of fire. Men fought now in pairs, in threes, covering one another, turning to face whatever came first. The smoke was so thick it clung to their skin, mingling with the sweat until their hands slipped on the wood of their rifles. Custer moved among them, still giving orders, still pointing to the gaps, his hat gone, his hair darkened with dust and sweat. Those who saw him in those final minutes later remembered not fear, but an intensity that burned through the noise. He had ridden through countless fights before, but here, he fought on foot alongside his men, his voice one more thread in the fabric of the battle's roar. The end, when it came, was not a single moment but a cascade, one man falling, then another, the gaps widening too fast to close, the ring around them collapsing inward. Shots gave way to the sharp crack of hand-to-hand blows, the shouts of men locked in a final struggle. Above it all, the sky was a hard, pitiless blue. The sun caught the dust and smoke rising from the ridge, turning it into a pale, shifting veil that hid the last shapes as they went down. When the noise faded, it did not fade all at once. It ebbed, as though the battle itself were stepping away, leaving only the wind in the grass, the low sounds of horses, and the distant shouts from the valley below. For those who stood on the slopes looking up at the ridge, the fight's ending was not a moment of triumph, but a mark. This was the place where they had stood, where they had held until the circle closed, where the ridge became a monument in the minds of all who had seen it. For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold. When the sound of gunfire was finally gone, the valley felt impossibly wide, as though the land itself had stretched to swallow the chaos. The ridge where Custer and his men had made their stand was quiet now, a seam of stillness stitched into the rolling grass. In the village, the elders spoke in low tones, their words carried by the wind rather than the drumbeat of battle. The fight had been fierce, costly on both sides, and it left behind more than the fallen. It left questions. Had the soldiers understood what they were riding into? Had they known how far the valley stretched, how many waited for them within its folds? Or had they thought, until the very last minute, that they could cut through and leave by another trail? From the hills to the south, the survivors of Reno's and Benteen's commands could see the rising haze where Custer's line had stood. They did not yet know the full measure of what had happened there. Only when scouts rode back with the news did the truth settle like a weight no one could shift. The other half of the regiment was gone. Benteen sat his horse in silence, scanning the distant ridge. He had fought enough battles to know what it meant when no movement showed. Reno said nothing for a long time, his jaw set hard. Around them, the men cleaned their weapons, refilled their canteens, and waited for orders that never came. Later, when they rode toward the ridge, the silence grew heavier. The land bore marks of the fight, churned soil where horses had struggled, patches of black where grass had burned, the faint metallic tang of powder still in the air. And then, the ridge itself, holding the still forms where the last stand had played out. No one spoke. Words were too small for the scene before them. They took in the positions, some men still in a firing stance, others close together as if they had turned to one another in the final seconds. Horses lay among them, their reins tangled, their flanks darkened by dust. From the other side, those who had fought to defend the village walked the ground as well. They moved with the quiet of those who knew the cost of a battle, even a battle won. Some stopped to look at the soldiers' positions, tracing in their minds the decisions and moments that had brought them here. One elder murmured a reminder to the younger men, "This is the shape of courage, theirs and ours. Do not forget either." In the years that followed, the ridge and the valley became a place of stories. Soldiers who had survived told of confusion, of orders carried by men who never returned, of a field that seemed to twist and grow around them. From the village came other accounts, of the way the soldiers fought without breaking, of how the defenders had been driven by the need to protect their families, of the deep quiet that followed when it was done. The battle entered books and reports, speeches and arguments. But for those who had been there, it was not a matter of strategy or maps. It was the smell of smoke at noon, the weight of a rifle gone hot from firing, the blur of a friend's face before the next rush came. Even decades later, when the grass grew tall again and the ridge lay in peace, the wind through that valley carried something with it, a reminder that history does not live in words alone, but in the places where it happened, and in the silence that follows. For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold.